with Dicker.
Everybody here understands the damage caused by addictions, not just to the individual, but also to families, marriages, and communities too. So nobody doubts for 1 minute the challenges the government face in trying to regulate, in this case, the gambling industry, to protect the most vulnerable, whilst at the same time allowing the vast majority to enjoy either their hobby or, in some cases, their profession without overburdened bureaucratic straitjackets, or indeed in a way that doesn't impose a nanny-state solution on the majorities. Now, the reason I say this is because if you restrict the industry too harshly, then the evidence, yes, the evidence shows that all you do is force people onto that black market or onto the dark web where there is absolutely no checks and balances in place to protect anyone. And no, it is not difficult to access if you need to use it or want to use it. The reality is that the problem gambling rates here in the UK at 0.3% are low compared to our neighbours. Italy, it's 2.4%, Norway, 1.4%, and France at 1.3%. And despite what the Honourable Lady from Swansea East says, the big part of the success is actually down to what the industry itself here in the UK itself have embraced with programmes like Be Gamble Aware, not just a saying or a catchphrase, but something very tangible in every regulated high street betting shop with human interaction as well as our online presence. The large players in this country, in this industry, have pledged contributions of over £100 million for research, education and treatment in this area, with a further 10... Of course.
Will the honourable gentleman acknowledge that the money that they've given, they say where it is spent? So they have influence over how that money is spent. Therefore, it precludes people from accessing services because they feel there is government, there is industry interference.
What I was trying to highlight was the fact that the Honourable Lady said earlier that the industry were doing nothing. And the reality is they're not doing nothing. And my point is that it's actually contributing towards the reason why we have a much lower gambling problem in this country compared to our neighbours. And I was going on to say they're also spending a further £10 million specifically targeted for safer gambling education to all 11 to 19-year-olds across the country. And as we know, as we've seen over the pandemic, when we're all working from home, advertising around safer gambling is a much larger proportion of the money spent on gambling adverts. Now, this all, of course, doesn't mean that we do nothing more. It really does not mean that we do nothing more. Of course, there is more to do, and anyone who's experienced living with problem gambling will know how potentially life-damaging this is for everybody around them. So it's only right that any review around gambling has the most vulnerable at its heart. Let's just briefly look at what happened when you abandon a balanced, competitive, regulated market, which is the only way to deter that hugely increasing black market. I mentioned Norway earlier, and they introduced restrictions on stakes, introduced strict affordability checks and curbs on advertising. And instead of protecting the most vulnerable, what it actually did was drove them to the black market, where 66% of all gambling now in Norway is done on the black market. And if you have a look at, there's no interaction, no human interaction on that market, no checks on affordability, and no lifelines available either. So their 1.4% of problem gambling actually is much higher because they do not know where those problem gamblers are. Of course they will.
Just to make a further point about the black market, he rightly draws attention to the lack of protection for problem gamblers, but there's also no protection for people to actually get paid out if they have a winning bet. They don't have any of the security that we have here in the United Kingdom, that they will be treated fairly by the operator, let alone all the problem gambling measures that we have here in the UK.
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. That is also a legal protection that you get under a regulated market, which we have here in the UK. Of course I will.
And can I draw the committee's attention to my entries in the Register of Interest? There's also a further point which has not been mentioned. I represent the Cheltenham Racecourse, and 45% of horse racing's income comes from bookmakers. So it's extremely important that we tackle problem gambling. One problem gambler is one too many. But isn't that statistic very important when the government considers how to take a balanced approach? Because I know the entire horse racing sport is very, very worried indeed about the potential loss of income in what is not a well-funded sport.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's not just with horse racing. We see it in things like snooker and darts as well, which relies on that funding to make sure that it is as popular today as we see. But I've mentioned Norway. Let me just go on to highlight a similar story in France, where online gambling is illegal. They see 57% of all gambling done on the black market. In Bulgaria, it's 47%. In Italy, it's 23% of all money staked now goes to the black market. Here in the UK, whilst the figures are still low in comparison, we've seen a large rise in online unregulated gambling, going from 2.2% to 4.5% over the last 18 months as well. And the thing about unregulated black markets, I will wind up, of course, is it's not just the money, but the average stakes are much, much higher, with billions and billions of pounds going. So to summarise, Ms Rees, all I ask is that let us please be careful what we ask for. Whilst the scourge of addiction is a problem that we do need to address, I believe we have to be very careful that an act of all good intentions does not make the problem far worse than it currently is. The evidence for this is there if the government is keen to look. We mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and the government needs to work closely with the industry on solutions, not destroy good intentions by imposing on the industry rather than working with it. Thank you, Ms.
I'm sorry for the 3 speakers remaining. We only have